I'm just waiting to see. There we go. Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Jim O'Neill. I'm an MSW intern at University Louisville Traeger Institute. I want to welcome everybody to this breakout session number 5, grief and loss, understanding and providing support. Before we get started, I just want to remind people that we do offer CEUs for this, and there is a questionnaire or evaluation that you should have received an email on. It's the title line is OAC 2023 post-session evaluation link, April 15th through 18. And we do welcome your support, and we're interested in your feedback. So during the course of the presentation, if you want to ask a question, please, if you enter it in the chat, Dr. Schapmire is going to have some time towards the end to ask questions. So without further ado, I would like to present, we're very grateful to have Dr. Schapmire here today, who's going to talk to you about grief and loss.
All right, thank you, and welcome everyone. I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see here, window and share. Okay, and then just confirming, Jim, are you seeing the correct one?
You are. You're on the first page of the PowerPoint.
Okay, great. So I am Dr. Tara Schapmire, and I'm an associate professor of medicine at the University of Louisville, and I also teach in the master's program as well as one class in the undergrad bachelor's level program in social work. So I do classes in death and grief and psychosocial oncology, group methods. I teach in anatomy and physiology for the social sciences class for the undergrad students. And my background is as an oncology and palliative care social worker. And I practiced at Baptist for years before going back and getting my PhD. And now I was part of an amazing interprofessional team at Baptist. And now doing the care, and now I'm part of this team at U of L doing psychosocial oncology, palliative care, care for older adults, again with another interprofessional team. So it's all teaching and research now. The one clinical thing that I still do is a support group for women with stage 4 breast cancer at our local Gilda's Club. I do that group in order to just continue to inform, my all the things that I'm doing in research and teaching. So the objectives for today are to define the key concepts related to grief and loss and explore theoretical frameworks for understanding grief. We're going to clarify factors that influence individual grief responses and identify cognitive behavioral support options for those experiencing grief and loss. And it's really important to understand that this talk is aimed to all of us, both as grievers as well as supporters. And I'm going to be talking about death or about grief related to death a lot. But as you'll see, this is not the only form of grief. And this information can be applied to all kinds of grief. So I'm going to be covering a lot of terms, theory, definitions, in hope of bringing them all to life for you. But just be sure and as if you want to ask your questions in real time, you can post them in the chat, and then hopefully we will have time at the end for Q&A. So first and foremost, think about this. We form attachments to enrich our lives, and doing so puts us at risk of encountering loss. So we can't have attachments without loss. So that's a major premise to think about. And there are many, many types of loss. That go beyond death, for example. The primary losses, which include the termination of close attachments or relationships, followed by the secondary losses that follow those primary losses. There can be death-related losses as well as losses not associated with death. There can be non-finite losses, things that go on and on and on, and ambiguous losses such as traumatic losses. So we can have grief responses to each of these things. And we really must understand the nature of grief. It's far more complex than most people think. First and foremost, it's important to think about what grief is. So depending upon, whether you're a clinician or a patient or family member or a caregiver, think about the definition of grief. Have you thought about the definition? And what it actually is, and have you perhaps only associated it with mourning a death? Well, here's a definition that I really love of grief, and that is a term that includes all of one's personal reactions, both internally and externally, to real or perceived loss. And notice the key term there: perceived loss is important. It's not just real. So that includes things like beliefs about a loss, whether they're real or not, and as well as anticipatory loss. And grief can be experienced and expressed in numerous ways, from physical, emotional, through feelings, and cognitively through thoughts. It can be expressed behaviorally, socially, and even spiritually. So that's grief. And you hear these terms, all of these terms, used interchangeably a lot. And I just want to highlight some quick differences between them. So bereavement is a state. It's a state of having lost specifically a significant other to a death. Usually we use the term bereavement when we are talking about a death-related loss. Grief is the personal response to loss. So that is what I just defined. And then, of course, mourning is the public expression of that loss. So just quick and easy and important distinctions. So let's see here, moving on. The term bereavement identifies the objective situation of individuals who have experienced a loss of someone or a thing they valued. Although there may be many possible losses, we most often use this word to associate with a death, as I said. And there are three essential elements: an attachment or relationship with some person or thing that is valued, the loss, ending, termination, separation of that relationship, and an individual who is deprived of the valued person or thing by the loss. And then mourning is that essential process for those who are trying to cope with the loss, helping bereaved persons find a way to go forward with healthful and living and adapt to a new world in which they find themselves. So it's that outward or public interpersonal process, the overt, visible, or shared expressions of grief, together with efforts to obtain social support. And then just some notes about all of these terms. You know, human beings react in many different ways to significant losses. And these reactions can be unusual in a person's life, but that doesn't mean that they're abnormal. For example, like disease. So after a death, only part of our grief is for the person who died, but much of our grief is for ourselves as people who have been left behind. And grief is an individualized phenomenon, unique in many ways to each particular loss and griever. So one person's grief should not be used as a standard for another. So, these are really important things to think about as we finish the rest of our time together, because it's really important to understand that, whatever grief is for you is most likely normal for you, whether that is not normal for another person. And a brief side comment on what we call anticipatory grief. In the realm of, working in hospitals, for me, for example, I did a lot of anticipatory grief work with patients and families who were living with disease or even terminal disease and anticipating a death. And so the process of grief that they go through in anticipation of the loss is an important thing to remember. And it is separate from the grief after. So it's a pre-death experience and components of the larger context of reacting and coping with dying itself. And then, sometimes people wonder, they ask themselves, I'm not doing what everybody else is doing. I seem fine. Am I grieving? Is it normal that I'm not grieving? Can it be absent? And someone named Deutsch way back suggested that, and others thought that the absence of feelings or grief reactions to the loss of a loved individual was problematic. But George Bonanno has done tons of research on grief and responses to trauma and loss through the years, and he disagreed with that. He argued that many individuals' grief reactions are mild because they're resilient grievers who tended to be generally optimistic, were in good psychological health, had an intrinsic sense of spirituality, focused on positive memories, enjoyed facing challenges, and had a belief that even in the worst situations, they could learn and grow. And so, he found in his research that, and again, this is real empirical research data that he's collected on people who are experiencing grief, the majority of grievers fall in that resilient category. But there are some types of loss that are more complicated, and traumatic loss and death is certainly kind of falls in that category. And that's associated with the suddenness or lack of anticipation of a loss or death. It might include violence, mutilation or destruction. The preventability or the randomness of the act might be involved. It may involve multiple deaths or losses. And the mourner's personal encounter with death, including either a significant threat or to personal survival, or a massive or shocking confrontation with the death and mutilation of others, is also involved in the traumatic death. So we in the city of Louisville last week experienced some traumatic death with the bank shooting, and many of us, and particularly those bank employees and the officers and first responders involved, are still dealing with that traumatic loss and grief response that's associated with that. Traumatic events can shatter what we call our assumptive worlds. And those things are defined as a strongly held set of assumptions about the world and the self, which is confidently maintained and used as a means of recognizing, planning, and acting. So beliefs like the world is benevolent, the world is meaningful, I'm worthy, I deserve good things to come my way. The beliefs like that are what speaks to our assumptive world, and a traumatic loss can really rock that. The belief that God's going to take care of me, for example, and then the experience that maybe, the way you interpret a traumatic loss, you don't feel as though God took care of you. That is challenging your assumptive world. So all of the theorists, and I'm going to go through several, but they all kind of talk about, things that impact differences in the way people grieve. And 5 kind of most critical variables include the nature of the prior attachment or the perceived value the lost person or thing has for the bereaved individual. So the nature of the attachment and the perceived value will impact the way a person grieves. The way in which the loss occurred and the concurrent circumstances of the bereaved person. So if it was a traumatic loss and the bereaved person is also dealing with other issues and stresses in their life, that's going to impact the way they grieve. Coping strategies of the bereaved individual. So, how they always coped with loss or stress. If they're choosing healthier, life-affirming coping strategies versus life-depleting strategies. And then the developmental situation of the bereaved person, where they are in the life course, will inform how they respond. And then the nature of the support available to the bereaved person after the loss is very important. The social support, you hear that over and over again, very, very important. And some of the theories, I'm going to go through them quickly, but some of the earlier theoretical models assumed that there was this universal human pattern to how human beings responded to loss, and that the pattern is best understood as a series of normative stages or phases, which successful mourners have to work through, quote unquote, towards some goal of, again, quote unquote, completion. And that has really been debunked in more recent years with all the new theories and the research that has come out, that's suggesting that people's responses to loss are very personal in character. There are no universal patterns, that they're very much impacted by cultural norms and social expectations, and that they can be complex personal interactions with emotional, cognitive, behavioral, and social and spiritual components. So one example of early kind of theory that many people are familiar with is the Kubler and Ross 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Interestingly, she did this research on people who were experiencing anticipatory grief, people who were living with serious illness and terminal illness, and exploring the stages of grief that they were going through. And that the world has taken these stages and applied it to grief and bereavement after a loss, when the original research was not around, not targeted to those individuals. But the work of Kubler-Ross and Kessler and others has continued on through the years, and they've really tried to clarify it's not stepping from one to the next to the next to the next, that people really can go through or identify or recognize these different stages at any point over the course of their grieving experience, and that they shouldn't be done in any prescribed order. But this is still considered one of the earlier kind of understandings. And newer understandings offer a broader and more inclusive understanding of loss, an expanded appreciation of what is involved in grief. And really, they caution about the classical accounts of universal phases or stages of grief, and new accounts of personal pathways and possibilities for active coping and bereavement are important. And then revising and renewing relationships versus relinquishing ties. And that's really critical. And we'll get into a little bit of this. Appreciations of possibilities for transformation and growth in grief are also, suggested by the newer theories, and the recognition of more complicated variants and the necessary for careful assessment by licensed individuals sometimes is appropriate. So some of these new models include things like tasks in mourning, that's from Worden, the dual process model, the something called adaptive grieving styles from Doka and Martin, and then some efforts at meaning reconstruction by Schapmire. And we're going to go into these. So Worden had 4 tasks of mourning, and these are very, very popular and very useful. And I teach these in my death and grief class to the students who want to counsel people in the future. And that these 4 tasks include accepting the reality of the loss, and then processing the pain of grief, adjusting to a world without the deceased, and finding an enduring connection with the deceased in the midst of embarking on a new life. And again, it's not necessarily an ordered thing, it's just tasks. So in thinking about task 1, to accept the reality of the loss, just realizing that the person is dead is one of the first things that happens. And then people can come to the belief that the reunion is impossible, at least in this life. And it's the opposite of acceptance, or the opposite of acceptance is denial of the loss or its meaning. So if someone is in denial, then that's really not accepting the loss. And acceptance must be both intellectual and emotional. And so those are some things to think about with accepting the reality of the loss. And then working through the pain of grief is another one. Pain may be physical, emotional, behavioral. Working through pain is essential, but it is not always supported by society. And the negation of this task is to deny feelings. Task 3 is to adjust to an environment where the deceased is missing. So that's external adjustments, your house that you come home to, that your partner or loved one was always there, adjusting to their absence. Internal adjustments, that's, the internal dialogue you have with yourself about that person. Spiritual adjustments. And arresting of this stage is absolutely not adjusting to the loss. So again, more to think about. And then finding an enduring connection with the deceased while embarking on a new life. And this one is my favorite and most beautiful task. And for me is what makes my own grieving of my own loved ones over the course of my life so meaningful. So finding an appropriate place for the dead in our emotional lives, finding ways to memorialize the dead loved one while moving on with life. And really, non-completion of this task would be to choose to not love again, for example. So thinking of ways to still have that person in my life while still moving on. Very important. And then there's something called the dual process model, and it describes you can see the picture there on the right, and it describes an oscillation between 2 sets of dynamic and interrelated processes in coping and bereavement. And it involves, both working through one's loss and grief and addressing secondary losses and new challenges. And it views coping with bereavement as a differing from one cultural group to another, one individual to another, and one moment to another. And so you see here the oscillation between loss-oriented grief and restoration-oriented grief, and that all people go back and forth between those 2 things. So loss-oriented involves dealing with many of the intense emotions that occur after separation. And then restoration refers to the ways in which bereaved individuals attempt to reconstruct or re-engage in their life without the deceased. So it's also very, very useful in really helping us understand our own grief process and that of others. And then Doka and Martin really kind of debunked the whole gender norming for grief for grieving by describing what they call adaptive grieving styles, where they distinguish between intuitive grievers who emphasize experiencing and expressing emotion, and instrumental grievers who focus on practical matters, tasks, and problem solving. And these are really the poles on a spectrum, and they can be mixed or blended, and we can be all over the place as well as grievers, but we each have kind of a primary place where we kind of land in our grieving style. But it's, to be clear, it's not about gender, and it's about style. So it really challenges the belief that, the feminine model is the only way to mourn is to express emotion, and the traditionally masculine model would be to suppress emotion or to hide vulnerability. So this is another really useful way of thinking about grief. And then meaning reconstruction by Niemeyer. That reflects the natural desire for humans to impose some structure or coherence on disorder and chaotic elements in our lives. And it includes meaning making, meaning finding, making sense of the loss. So for example, developing a benign or a favorable account of the significance of the loss, often achieved through religious or philosophical or spiritual frameworks, and focusing on the positive benefits that apply to those left behind. So really, really a beautiful theory. And again, happy to share resources with you to read more and learn more about each of these. 3 essential components in meaning reconstruction involve grieving, entailing reaffirming and reconstructing a world of meaning that has been challenged by the loss, and that adaptation to bereavement typically involves redefining rather than relinquishing a continued bond with the deceased. So again, maintaining that continued bond with the deceased, but just redefining what it looks like. And that involves narrative methods, which can play a role in restoring, or what they call restoring, a sense of autobiographical coherence that has been disrupted by the loss. So my example is, I was raised by my grandparents, and I have their pictures in my bedroom. And every morning I wake up and look over and see those pictures, and I maintain a daily kind of interaction with them. I just look at them, smile. Sometimes I say hello. That is my way of just maintaining a relationship. And on occasion they visit my dreams, and I see that as a continued relationship as well. And then continuing bonds, really by Class, Silverman, and Nickman, kind of basically they posit that death ends a life, but it does not necessarily end a relationship. So you can see how each of these that I'm talking about really are related, and really do focus on, letting go of the old term of letting go. Like when you were grieving, you do not have to let go. You can maintain a bond and just redefine what that looks like. So continuing bonds are seen as the efforts of many bereaved persons to maintain an ongoing connection with their deceased loved one that can involve an internal representation of that individual. They can be dynamic, not static, involving negotiating and renegotiating the meaning of loss over time, and can develop in ways that allow the deceased to remain a transformed but ongoing presence in the inner lives of the bereaved. And it really can provide solace, comfort, and support, while also easing the transition from the past to the future, at least for some bereaved persons. And it certainly has been for me. And one of the ways, a classic modern version of continuing bonds is Facebook memorials, using social media to maintain the account of the deceased person, and the way people will on occasion visit that deceased person's Facebook page and share a memory. That's an example of a continuing bond. And then, again, just reaffirming, like moving from that fixed endpoint into transformations and growth when it comes to grief. So examples of fixed endpoint include, I already said letting go, but another one is recovery. When we talk about recovery as a goal of mourning, another one is resolution, the idea that one is healed or could be essentially unchanged by the loss experience. And then completion, that's the letting go piece, the idea that once and for all closure, after which there is no more mourning. And these are generally debunked by research and all these theories. They basically say there's no fixed point in bereavement, grief, and mourning. We're told time heals, but actually it is not the time we have to use, but the use that we make of time. And asking when mourning is finished is a little like asking how high is up. Warden said this. There's no ready answer. There's a sense in which mourning can be finished when people regain an interest in their life, feel more hopeful, experience gratification, and adapt to new roles. There's also a sense in which mourning is never finished. And that's certainly been the case for me with the death of my grandparents. It's been years, and I still miss them, but I have redefined the relationship and continued that bond. And then, dying and bereavement both involve dangerous opportunities. They are and can become transformative experiences and challenges whose outcomes may leave us better off or worse off. As a rough guideline, we might say that when mourning is advancing satisfactorily, when the bereaved that it is advancing satisfactorily when the bereaved person is able to think of the deceased person without the same intensity of pain that was previously experienced. And evidence of this ability is usually apparent when the bereaved person can once again take up the tasks of daily living and can reinvest in life. But there are complicated grief reactions, broadly defined as intense grief after the death of a loved one, that lasts longer than expected according to social norms, causes functional impairments. And two key points include the personal distress and disruption or dysfunction in everyday activities, and the nature is chronic, persistent, and prolonged in duration. And complications typically develop as a result of difficulties in the relationship with the deceased. Maybe, I've heard people say that the grief is as complicated as the relationship was complicated, things like that. Circumstances of the death, again, can complicate grief. The bereaved person's own history or personality, social factors, again. But critics of this construct do argue that it risks stigmatizing, pathologizing, and medicalizing a normal, if difficult, bereavement experience by imposing an external social role with cultural, historical origins in place of an internal reality. And it also can medicalize it by turning a familiar supportive work on the part of family members and friends to a secularly trained professional. So that's why the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual from the American Psychological Association, after years of research, created an actual mental health diagnosis called prolonged grief disorder. They stayed away a little bit from the complicated piece, but because they were hesitant, because they didn't want to give a psychiatric diagnosis to something that really was seen as normal. But they did see enough of something in the population where 7 to 10% of bereaved adults did experience persistent symptoms of prolonged grief disorder. So it is a newer diagnosis that came out in 2022. Symptoms of prolonged grief disorder include things like identity disruption, such as feeling as though a part of oneself has died, a marked sense of disbelief about the death, avoidance of reminders of that the person is dead, intense emotional pain such as anger, bitterness, sorrow related to the death, difficulty with reintegration such as problems engaging with friends, pursuing interests, and planning for the future, and emotional numbness, absence or marked reduction in an emotional experience, feeling that life is meaningless, and intense loneliness, feeling alone or detached from others. So again, these are the things that mark over time where these things are persistent, that you get into the prolonged grief kind of category. But it's important still to remember that grief is a reaction to loss. It is a dis-ease or a discomforting disturbance of everyday equilibrium. Grief is not a disease or a sickness or morbid unhealthy condition of the mind or body. It's distinct from clinical depression, which is a mental disorder or disease and is complicated by or pathological form of grieving characterized by angry impulses toward the ambivalent, loved person, impulses turning inward toward the self. So it's important to separate those things out. And although sadness and other common manifestations of grief do resemble some of the symptoms associated with clinical diagnosis of depression, normal grief reactions do not include, for example, the loss of self-esteem. So again, most grief is healthy, normal, and an appropriate reaction to loss. So we speak in terms of signs of or manifestations of grief and not symptoms of grief. And this is just an example of Bonanno's trajectories that I talked about. George Bonanno, who's done all this research over the last 30 years on people's responses to traumatic losses, people's responses to death and grief. And so on the y-axis there on the left, you see symptoms and distress. So, they go up high on the left side. And then on the x-axis at the bottom, it goes out 2 years. So from the point of trauma right there at the beginning, you can have low or high distress, and it goes on out. And he says basically that 55 to 85% have this bottom bar here, which is a resilient response to grief. They don't have a really high symptom or distress burden, and they just kind of stay, initially there is some, obviously, but over time they stay stable, as opposed to these others here that you see that range in numbers from, the chronic grievers who stay high on all of their symptoms, the delayed who start a little bit lower and go high over time with their symptoms, and then the recovery group who has a really high starting point from trauma, and then over time get into the realm of the resilient. So just another evidence-based picture of what grieving can look like for many. Now, grief in families, they do provide a context that influences individual members' experiences of loss, grief, and mourning. And, families do differ in the ways that they affect members' bereavement. For example, being permissive or restrictive or supportive or unsupportive as a family can impact individual grief within the family. And then, only individuals experience grief. Families are not persons, and they do not engage in these interpersonal processes. So grieving as a unit, there could be shared grief experiences, but, grief, again, even within a family, each individual may grieve in a different way, and that is okay. And families do engage in a type of systemic coping with loss, and that's that shared grief experience that I talked about. 5 fundamental needs of bereaved persons. This was put out a long time ago, but it's important to think about because it's really close to just what everybody needs, right? Social support, nutrition, hydration, exercise, and rest. So even someone who's had a recent loss, we can, if we are offering help, in a counseling realm, or in, just a supportive friend or family realm, these are things to think about that are important. Unhelpful messages, things like attempting to minimize the loss that has been experienced, very unhelpful. Admonitions not to feel, or at least not to do so in public. Strong grief reactions that one has experienced, not helpful either. And suggestions to get back to living promptly and not disturb others with one's grief and mourning, again, not helpful. And it's important to kind of highlight something called disenfranchised grief that was developed by DOCA, the grief that persons experience when they incur a loss that is not or cannot be openly acknowledged, publicly mourned, or socially supported. So, for example, these are, this is a real grief experience for us, for any one of us over the course of our lives when, for example, we have a strong grief response to the loss of a pet. Sometimes that can be disenfranchised grief. The mother of the shooter from the bank here in Louisville last week, she's going to be going through a lot of disenfranchised grief as well, because although there may be people who feel for her, there's going to be a lot of other people who will be blaming her in part for what her son did at the bank. So disenfranchised grief has structural elements. The relationship when it was not granted social approval, the loss when the significance is not recognized by society, and the griever when he or she is not viewed by society as entitled to the experience of grief or the process of mourning. So those are the structural elements. And then the dynamic or functional elements of bereavement include the grief reactions. So when the individual's experience or expressions of grief are viewed as inappropriate, maybe too much, and the mourning responses when the individual's ways of coping with his or her grief and loss are rejected by society. So all of those fall in the category of disenfranchised grief. So constructive suggestions for bereaved persons: don't blame yourself for what has happened. Don't be brave and strong. Don't try to run away. After the death of a child, don't feel that you owe it to the dead child to spend the rest of your life in the place in which he or she lived. And don't feel sorry for yourself. Easy, quick things to remember. More: immediately after the death, do something specific to help or make known in other practical ways your willingness to help. Respect preferences the family may have to be alone. Assist in practical ways through the time of the funeral. In a difficult time after the funeral, which is oftentimes even more difficult, do not avoid contact with the bereaved. Act normally and mention the name of the deceased person in ways that would have been natural before the death. This is really, really critical because people think that if they bring up the name of the person who has died, that it's going to cause more grieving. No, the grieving is going on always, and people who are grieving usually appreciate having their loved one brought up. Permit the bereaved to determine how and when they do or do not wish to talk about the deceased person. Don't try to answer unanswerable questions or force your religious or philosophical beliefs upon vulnerable bereaved persons. Don't say, I know how you feel, no matter how much it may seem to be the case. This is never true unless you've actually walked in the exact same path. Be available, but allow the bereaved person to find their own individual ways through their mourning. And then with those tasks that I talked about at the beginning, the cognitive, behavioral, social, and so on, ways of helping them in each of those realms. So on the cognitive task side, they involve a need for prompt and accurate and reliable information. So if you're, if you're able to do that, that can be helpful in the cognitive realm, particularly important when the death is unexpected, untimely, traumatic, or self-inflicted. Especially important for bereaved persons who are used to exercising a greater degree of control over their environments. When they feel helpless, offering cognitive support can help. Cognitive tasks may be difficult for bereaved individuals whose social roles make it hard for them to seek information and assistance from others. Now, effective tasks involve a need to express reactions to a loss or death. So making it creating a space so that they can just express things. And it may require assistance in identifying and articulating feelings and other reactions that are strange or unfamiliar. And what is most needed is the company of a caring person who can acknowledge the expression and validate the appropriateness of the emotional reactions. So just being that safe person for the person who is grieving, who will allow them to scream, cry, react in anger, admit their frustration with the person who has died, admit their anger with the person who has died, because again, we can have a mix of emotions. Behavioral tasks involve a need to mark or take notice of the death through some external event or action. So may include commemorative activities designed to remember the life of the deceased or the legacy that he or she has left behind. The important point here is that something is done to take note of the life that has now ended and to celebrate the meaning or impact beyond itself. Valuational tasks involve a need to make sense out of the loss. So that meaning-making stuff that we talked about earlier. Some people have such a faith or trust in their basic values that they can incorporate a loss directly or patiently await clarification. Others must repeatedly ask, why? Some ways of making meaning are unique. Many are widely shared by human beings. So again, it can be very strange compared to the way others do it, but it's still, if it makes sense for a person who's grieving, their unique way of meaning making is totally fine. And almost all human beings need some conviction that life truly is worth living, even when the death has taken someone that is loved. And Worden distinguished between grief counseling and grief therapy. And grief counseling is generally the thing that all of us can do, whether we are loved ones, family members, helping just facilitate the work of bereaved persons who are coping with normal and uncomplicated grief and mourning. Versus grief therapy, which takes more of the specialized trained professionals to help someone deal with some of that like prolonged grief stuff that I talked about in the DSM earlier. So 10 really important principles, according to Worden, for grief counseling are to help the bereaved person actualize the loss, make it real, help the bereaved person identify and then express feelings, assist in them in living without the deceased, help finding meaning in the loss, facilitating emotional relocation of the deceased, providing time to grieve, interpreting normal behavior, allowing for individual differences, examining defenses and coping styles, and identifying pathology and referring on. So that is it. That's all I have for you today. So I'm going to stop the share and see what questions you have for the rest of our time. So Jim, I'm looking. Okay, let's see. I see a chat there. Leo says, do complications of grief seem to affect certain people more, such as people who have underlying anxiety? Yeah, so that goes back to, someone's, yes, the answer is yes to your question. Someone's history of coping, whether that is personality style or mental health issues, will impact the way someone grieves, for sure. And it could have a difference. And do you have some examples of meaning making that some people have done? So any type of memorialization of the person that involves a period of time where you, for example, are doing the, when we hold a funeral, that is meaning making in and of itself. We create a service that memorializes the person. So that's one easy example. Meaning making around that loss can continue to go on, and meaning making and making sense of the relationship that you had with the loved one can continue to go on, as long as you're asking the questions of why, and exploring how to make sense of what happened, whether that's positive sense or negative sense, is an attempt at meaning making. So many examples of that. Like, again, one way to do it would be that my family does it, is at the holidays. We always bring something that one of our grandparents would have done, a recipe, or we'll spend time talking about what Mimi would have said about something, so that we have continued the bond with her, but we also have made meaning out of her loss, that like it goes on. And that's why these are also so closely tied to each other. But there's just so many opportunities out there for meaning making. Other thoughts? You can think about sources of meaning, and there's things like traditional, I kind of talked about it, evaluational sources of meaning, experiential sources of meaning. So like you could decide, one literally everything I'm thinking about now is meaning. My Mimi loved flowers. She would always point out, when we were driving in the car, different plants, and she would tell me what they were. And so now when I see those, I think of her, and I make meaning of that. And it brings joy to me to look at a plant, and to think, okay, Mimi would have been telling me that that's a poplar or whatever. And then my papa was sunsets. And so I can't watch a sunset without thinking of him and feeling in relationship with him. So just more examples. Any other questions? Do you think having anticipatory grief could help the overall grief process? Yes, if you are given an opportunity to identify your anticipatory grief as what it is through, whatever supports you're seeking. So anticipatory grief, for example, if it's being experienced by someone with a serious illness, in their interactions with the healthcare system, they are hopefully meeting, mental health professionals at least once through the process to identify some of that stuff, and then to look for sources of healthy coping. And then those who are bereaving, like if, let's say you're a caregiver for someone with dementia, you definitely are experiencing anticipatory grief, because, your real grief in the person and the changes that they've already gone through, as well as, the things that are going to be happening. And the way you learn to cope with that while you're in that anticipatory phase will absolutely impact the way you cope after. Will it prevent a post-death grief? No, but it definitely will inform the way you grieve after, and your source of coping. Any other questions? James, are you still here? Because if someone wishes to unmute, we may have lost our facilitator, our host, because I think you guys can't unmute yourself if you just want to ask a question, but he can oh, go ahead. So I was just going to
I'm still here. If somebody wants to raise their hand, I can unmute them.
Okay. So he can, there we go. We have Dina.
And hopefully, here we go. Enable microphone. Enable microphone. It's not. Unfortunately, I'm clicking. Oh, there it is.
And if it doesn't work, you can always type it.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Dean. I've hit it like 6 times and it's not doing anything.
Let's see. So Beth Morgan says, this is the first time I've heard the term resilient griever. It seems that resiliency is a necessary element in coping with many of life's challenges that yes, absolutely. All challenges can be
Dina.
I'm sorry. Hearing this background almost like
I think we just Dina's microphone just activated.
Okay, well maybe if you mute her again, and I'll thank you all. Beth, yes, I completely agree with you. When I meet someone, I am grief and resiliency in grief and responding to loss is a major framework that I use for lots of things. Yes, in general, we the human beings have evolved over millions of years to be pretty resilient to most things, and that's why that was such a large number by Bonanno. And he has books and articles. George Bonanno is his name. I've got one book here behind me, but it's under a stack. I'm afraid to try to grab it. But his latest book is called The End of Trauma, and it's based on his 30 plus years of research around that and the way we respond to trauma. Now that we still need to be trauma informed for sure in our care of others, but he does see hope through that resilience piece. And Dina, if you're able to type, I'm still happy to take your questions. Sorry about the complications with the trying to allow people to speak. Let's see here. Aside from personal experience, how do you recommend individuals become more resilient, particularly when lacking difficult circumstances in life? It starts with, understanding and really, like in my role as a social worker, for example, I would get them talking about, how they have, we social workers, we think from a strengths-based perspective many times. So in my questions and trying to understand, the losses that have been associated with whatever it is that's going on with them, whether that's disease or bereavement or whatever, how have they coped in the past with various losses or traumas, trying to get out what their, what their strengths are, as well as also what, are there any unhealthy or less helpful or, non-life affirming kind of coping approaches. But usually through repeated questioning, we can find examples from that they provide just through our questioning around how they have found support and coped with things in the past. So that's it's probably a longer answer than I can do here, but helping them, asking questions in a way that can help them get to know themselves better, and then normalizing their responses as much as possible, making it safe for them to talk about things can bring out, their own sense of resilience. Thank you. Are there any other questions? If there aren't, we don't have to stay on. I'm happy to stay on the full time, but if there are no questions, I know this is probably a long conference day for all of you. If you want to take back some extra time, you absolutely can.
Okay, I think that looks like it at this point. I want to thank everyone once again. Obviously, thank Dr. Schapmire for the presentation. This is something that I think we all experience in life, and it never gets easy. But having the kind of information that she's provided today does at least give us something in our toolkit to help ourselves and others. But thank you for being in breakout session number 5, grief and loss, understanding and providing support. I just want to remind everyone about the evaluation in the email. It should have on the subject line said OAC 2023 post-session evaluation link April 15 through 18. And that's one way that you can go and get your CEUs for this as well. Again, thank you very much, Dr. Schapmire. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great
Bye-bye.
job. And we made it. We made it. So
Great. Thank you.
all right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.